By the way, just so you guys know, we have, if you can leave, this is something I should have mentioned in announcements. I always forget something. If you, when we're done, instead of stacking up the chairs, just leave them out. And we're going to leave all the audio-visual stuff out and stuff too. Actually, I guess the camera could be put away. But our denomination that our church is a part of, Evangelical Mennonite Conference, has been a huge blessing to us. As we're still a church plant, we aren't financially supporting ourselves yet. We get support from a number of other churches in this area. And this afternoon, we're having a meeting of some of the leadership from the different churches, and we're having it here afterwards at 3. So that should be a good time, and I'm glad that our church gets to host it for the first time as well. Anyways, so you said we're all set on the camera now? Thank you. If you would like to turn to Genesis 49, that's where we're going to be reading from this morning. Well, we've jumped a number of chapters, actually. Okay. So I had planned on finishing and moving on to a different sermon series, but it would not have been right to leave this passage out of the story of Jacob. This is the end of his story. The last sermon we had in this series was from Genesis 35. Now we're on Genesis 49, so we jumped the whole 14 chapters or so. And so just so you know what's going on in between there, the narrative in Genesis had been very focused on the story of Jacob, and we went through his whole story. I'll recap a little bit of that. But we went through his whole story, and then it moves on to speaking about a few other people, but mostly between Genesis 35 and this one is the story of Joseph. And if you're familiar with Joseph in the Technicolor Dreamcoat, that's a very, very loose interpretation of the biblical story of Joseph. And so, as we're going through the story of Joseph, you know, Joseph is the pride of the favorite of his father Jacob. We see that sin continuing in their family, of them picking favorites and holding them over the rest of the family, making everybody else jealous and causing conflict. And the brothers do get jealous, especially when Joseph tells them about this dream that he has where he's going to rule over them. And so they take him, and they originally are planning to kill him, then change plans and sell him into slavery. He goes into Egypt, and God blesses Joseph so immensely that Joseph ends up becoming the second in command over all of Egypt, right under the Pharaoh. And there's a whole bunch more to that story, of course. That's a whole different sermon series on its own. But this is how we end up with some of the stuff that happens in this passage, where they are in Egypt. And anyways, we'll talk a little bit about more some of that as we go along. So this morning we're going to focus on legacy. And think about what you want to be remembered for in your life, or what you want, maybe a better way to phrase it, what you want your legacy to be. For Jacob, he had started off as a man that was very ungodly, a man that I think would be fairly described by some of his actions as just a despicable type of person. And yet, as we saw his journey along the way, starting off with God appearing to him when he is traveling and he's in the wilderness, God appears to him, and we see Jacob start to turn to God, and he does that more and more as his story progresses. And now, Jacob is an old man, he's about to die, and he has some last words for his sons. So let's read We're going to read more than this, but let's start with Genesis 49. We're going to read verses 1 to 28. Then Jacob called for his sons and said, "Gather around so I can tell you what will happen to you in days to come. Assemble and listen, sons of Jacob. Listen to your father Israel. Reuben, you are my firstborn, my might, the first sign of my strength, excelling in honor, excelling in power. Turbulent as the waters, you will no longer excel. For you went up onto your father's bed, onto my couch, and defiled it. Simeon and Levi are brothers. Their swords are weapons of violence. Let me not enter their council. Let me not join their assembly. For they have killed men in their anger and hamstrung oxen as they pleased. Cursed be their anger so fierce and their fury so cruel. I will scatter them in Jacob and disperse them in Israel. Judah, your brothers will praise you. Your hand will be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's sons will bow down to you. You are a lion's cub, Judah. You return from the prey, my son. Like a lion, he crouches and lies down. Like a lioness, who dares to rouse him? The scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until he to whom it belongs shall come, and the obedience of the nations shall be his. He will tether his donkey to a vine, his colt to the choicest branch. He will wash his garments in wine, his robes in the blood of grapes. His eyes will be darker than wine, his teeth whiter than milk. Zebulun will live by the seashore and become a haven for ships. His border will extend toward Sidon. Issachar is a raw-boned donkey, lying down among the sheep pens. When he sees how good is his resting place and how pleasant is his land, he will bend his shoulder to the burden and submit to forced labor. Dan will provide justice for his people as one of the tribes of Israel. Dan will be a snake by the roadside, a viper along the path that bites the horse's heels, so that its rider tumbles backward. I look for your deliverance, Lord. Gad will be attacked by a band of raiders, but he will attack them at their heels. Asher's food will be rich. He will provide delicacies fit for a king. Naphtali is a doe set free that bears beautiful fawns. Joseph is a fruitful vine near a spring whose branches climb over a wall. With bitterness, archers attacked him. They shot at him with hostility. But his bow remained steady. His strong arms stayed limber. Because of the hand of the mighty one of Jacob, because of the shepherd, the rock of Israel, because of your father's God who helps you, because of the Almighty who blesses you with blessings of the skies above, blessings of the deep springs below, blessings of the breast and womb. Your father's blessings are greater than the blessings of the ancient mountains, than the bounty of the age-old hills. Let all these rest on the head of Joseph, on the brow of the prince among his brothers. Benjamin is a ravenous wolf. In the morning he devours the prey, in the evening he divides the plunder. All these are the 12 tribes of Israel, and this is what their father said to them when he blessed them, giving each the blessing appropriate to him. My back is acting up a little bit, so I'm going to take advantage of this chair. So, as we're picturing this, we need to think about the fact that Jacob at this point is 147 years old. That is a very old man. And he has his sons gathered around him, as we're going to see when we get to his death in the next little section there. He is most likely sitting on the edge of his bed, and he literally, with the last of what he has left, he is pronouncing these words over his sons. And now normally this would be the time when the patriarch of the family would pronounce his blessings and say who was receiving what and all those things. And instead we have the Lord through Jacob giving prophetic words over his sons, and not just his sons themselves, but each of these tribes that were going to come from his sons. They're all getting prophetic words about that, and I mean, some of these are definitely nicer ones than others. They will be 12 tribes of Israel, but right now they're just the 12 sons of Israel. He says in verse 2, assemble and listen, and right away my mind goes to the Avengers. Avengers assemble. He's assembling his sons, his family around him. He says, listen to your father, but really he's calling them to listen to the Lord speaking to them. He's giving words here that Jacob himself, of course, would have no way of knowing that some of these things would be very, very true. This is just the Lord speaking through him. And one of the things as I was looking through this is I was trying to figure out exactly why it is that he chooses the order that he does in giving out these prophetic words for his sons. And it seems to start off one way, and then I don't really honestly know why he chooses some of. My chair caught my mic. There we go. Am I back on? Okay. Let's move this up front. Or to the side, rather. There we go. So, he starts off from the oldest and going down for the first four, which kind of makes sense. And then he jumps down to Zebulun and Issachar, which, they're all from the same mom, but then he just kind of jumps around and goes all over the place. So that's just me saying, I don't know why he chose the order that he did, but this is the order in which he addresses his sons. Also, let's notice here a couple things. One is that Jacob defies cultural expectations here. It is the cultural expectation, the oldest son is the one who gets the greatest blessing, and that is certainly not what he does. And we'll talk about why in a minute. I also want us to notice he addresses two of his sons a lot longer than the others. He gets Judah and Joseph get the largest chunk of time, so to speak, out of these blessings or rather prophecies that he's giving. So let's go through. Now there's 12. We're going to go through some of them pretty quick. But let's go through some of these words that he has for his sons. And we will start with Reuben. And we can summarize his words to Reuben as him saying, you shall not excel. But when you look at those words, it starts off so well. Reuben, his firstborn, my might, the first sign of my strength, excelling in honor, excelling in power. Now, if you're Reuben standing there with all your brothers, with your dad there, that gets your expectations up, I'd imagine. And then it takes a turn. Turbulent as the waters, you will no longer excel. So one of the lessons I'll talk about more towards the end, but one of the things I want us to notice here is the biblical principle. We reap what we sow, right? And Reuben would have been in, I'm sure, for a much more significant blessing here, a much more positive word, but he slept with one of his father's concubines, which is a really obviously messed up thing to do, a very, very severe sin. And so just being told he's not going to excel, I think, is a pretty minimal response. Now, to be fair, we do have positive things about Reuben in the scriptures. Reuben is the one who, when the brothers earlier than we're looking right now in Genesis, when the brothers are planning to kill Joseph, Reuben's the one who makes sure they don't actually kill him. So that's something. But turbulent is a way to describe him. He is going different directions. He is not doing as he should be. And so there's a consequence to that. And he is reaping as he sowed. Then we get to Simeon and Levi. Their swords are weapons of violence. I won't go long into the story because we did a whole sermon on it. But just to refresh your memory for anyone that might not have been here, these are the two brothers who massacred an entire town. And it was because their sister had been raped, and so the desire for vengeance is understandable, and the desire for justice is good. But massacring an entire town, a little overboard, let's say. Their swords are weapons of violence. Absolutely they are. Brutal violence. These guys are capable of things that most people would never be, judging by their actions. And what is his response to this? What are the words of the Lord here? Let me not enter their council, let me not join their assembly. You don't want to be taking advice and counsel from someone who has a temper and who is as wild as these two are. I know that there was one friend of mine when I was growing up who was a pretty peaceful type of guy. I had a very bad temper as a teenager. I rubbed off on him in the wrong way. In retrospect, I was a bad influence on that guy. But we also need to be aware, what is our temper like? Should people be listening to our advice? Are we controlling our temper? Or are we letting it run wild and be as dangerous? Well, probably not as dangerous as Simeon and Levi, but is it dangerous? And so the response is, I will scatter them in Jacob and disperse them in Israel. Now, this is an interesting one because this pronouncement actually ends up being a curse on Simeon, but a blessing on Levi, on their tribes. So with Simeon, his tribe was scattered. They were the weakest of the tribes, numbers-wise. They were the smallest, and it was not a good result of them being scattered. On the other hand, the tribe of Levi, later on, if you remember if you're familiar with the story, when Moses goes onto the mountain to speak to the Lord and gets the 10 Commandments, the Israelites are left waiting at the base of the mountain, and in their impatience and their unfaithfulness, they build a golden calf to worship because they think God's taking too long. Maybe he's not with them anymore, and maybe Moses isn't coming back. So they build a golden calf to worship. It is the tribe of Levi that stays faithful to the Lord. And so they do not get a set plot of land the way the other tribes of Israel do. They are scattered. However, they are made into a tribe of where the priests will come from. And so it is a blessing to them. So both Simeon and Levi are scattered, but one's the blessing, the other is a curse. Charles Haddon Spurgeon, a famous 1800s pastor I love to quote, said, "Happy is that man who, though he begins with a dark shadow resting upon him, so lives as to turn even that shadow into bright sunlight. Levi gained a blessing at the hands of Moses, one of the richest blessings of any of the tribes." So, starts off badly, but there is a redemption for the tribe of Levi later on. Then he addresses Judah, one of the biggest sections. Judah, your brothers will praise you. Your hand will be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's sons will bow down to you. Those brothers are going to bow down to him. There is basically just blessing here. There's blessing and blessing and blessing. Verse 10, when it says, the scepter will not depart from Judah, the scepter, of course, being the staff that royalty would bear, right? And so the kings of Israel come from Judah. Nor the rulers, verse 10 again, nor the ruler's staff from between your feet will not depart from between your feet, until he to whom it belongs shall come, and the obedience of the nations shall be his. So let me mention here, this is one of two sections where I want to talk about a little bit of translation stuff. Everybody loves talking about biblical Hebrew, right? I won't get into detail on it. There are some translations that they say here, until it shall not depart until Shiloh shall come. I'm really not sure, honestly, why that is chosen for some translations. Because it's not actually a translation of the word, so Shiloh is a transliteration. So in other words, instead of taking the original Hebrew meaning of the word and putting it into English, they take the Hebrew word and they Englishify it, I don't know, that's not a word. You know what I mean? They change it into English letters and they put it in there. But the more literal meaning of the term is, until he to whom it belongs shall come. And I think that that is very fitting. And I think that this is also prophetic, because which tribe does Jesus come from? It is the tribe of Judah. And the scepter of royalty for the nation of Israel is not to depart until he to whom it belongs shall come. And that is Jesus. He is the rightful ultimate king, not only, of course, of Israel, but of all things, of everything. So I believe this is a prophecy about Jesus coming. And so Judah has received a very, very special blessing here. Each of these refer to the ruling position of Judah that he'll have among his brothers. He inherited that leadership position even though he's not the firstborn. And its position among his brothers meant that the kings are going to come from there. And verse 10 talks about other blessings. Now Jacob, there's some very poetic language being used here. But what he's saying is the tribe of Judah is going to be very, very blessed. And those blessings of abundance that are promised are intended to give a contrast, by the way, to the curse that was put on the earth back in Genesis chapter 3. When Adam and Eve sinned, what's it talk about? It talks about how mankind is going to have to toil and labor to produce the same kind of fruit that God originally had intended to be easily accessible. There's going to be thorns and thickets. That's part of the curse in Genesis 3. And so all of this blessing about how everything was going to be so abundant, this blessing that's given to the tribe of Judah, well, the tribe of Judah, did receive land that was very, very rich with a lot of different crops, including specifically it was known for having good grapes and wine that came from that. Wine was also a symbol in the Old Testament of blessing from the Lord. Some of you are thinking, yes, wine is definitely a blessing. Some of you are thinking not. Do it wisely if you're going to drink. That should go without saying. So, one of the other things I wanted to mention here, just to kind of give you an idea of the poetic language that is being used. It says, he will tether his donkey to a vine, his colt to the choicest branch. So, normally, do you think you would tether an animal like a donkey to a grapevine? Probably not, right? It's going to wreck that grapevine. It's going to pull that off, right? So he's just saying that it's poetic language, and we need to bear that in mind. But he's just saying there's going to be such an abundance that the vines are going to be so thick you could tie an animal to it, and they wouldn't be able to move. Right? And we should, by the way, that's a quick side note to mention, we should always try and be aware of what genre we are reading in the Bible, because that can sometimes change how we read it, right? So, for example, if we're reading the Gospels, that is historical narrative about the life of Jesus Christ. If we're reading the book of Psalms, all of that is poetry. So we should take what's said in historical narratives as literal history, whereas there's poetry can oftentimes not be taken literally. It's figurative. So it's important to note here, by the way, also about Judah, that he is not the greatest guy. We read before this in the life of Joseph, Judah he does a number of things wrong. One that we can mention right offhand is he is the one who suggests getting rid of Joseph in a way that profits them. So selling him. That's Judah's idea. So why does Judah get this big of a blessing? Such a positive blessing from the Lord here? I'm not 100% sure. I don't know. I have a theory, though. Toward the end of Joseph's story, Joseph tests his brothers to see if they are still as terrible as they were when they sold him their own brother into slavery. He tests his brothers by getting them to bring Benjamin, their father's new favorite son, also a child of Rachel, like Joseph was. He gets them to bring him. At this point, by the way, Joseph is in power in Egypt. He can do whatever he wants, virtually. And then he has Benjamin arrested and says the rest of the brothers can go free. And it's a test to see what they're going to do. Are they going to go and be happy they saved their own necks and got rid of another brother like they did Joseph? The brother who volunteers to stay behind, sacrifice himself so that Benjamin will be set free, is Judah. That is my best theory as to why Judah is given this blessing. The Savior, who is going to give his life for the world, comes from the tribe of the brother who was willing to sacrifice himself. And I think that there's something kind of beautiful there. Let's move on to, wow, time's going. Zebulun will live by the seashore. By the way, when we say blessing that was put on Judah, there was a blessing. Remember, I've talked a number of times in my sermons about how eventually Israel, which is made up of all these tribes, splits in two. Well, the northern tribe, or the southern tribe, is Simeon and Judah. And that's basically it. All the other tribes are the northern tribe. So Judah, his tribe, ends up being so blessed that they essentially are equal to almost all the other tribes combined in some ways. In military might later on, all that stuff. So there's a huge blessing. Zebulun will live by the seashore. Just to give you an idea, whoops, that's the wrong way. The wrong button. This is Zebulun, between the Sea of Galilee and the Mediterranean Sea. We'll live by the seashore. There's more we could go into that, but we got to keep going here. We got a bunch more brothers to go, and we got to wrap up still. Issachar is a strong donkey. Issachar was a large tribe, it was the third largest, and because of their size and how much they had, they were often the targets of oppressive foreign armies and were put into servitude. They were made slaves. And so what is said there about Issachar? He is like a wild donkey. He will bend his shoulder to the burden and submit to forced labor. And that very much comes true. Dan is a viper along the path. It's a good summary of how he's described. This foretells a time when the tribe of Dan becomes treacherous. And we see in Judges chapter 18, when the Israelites have gone into the promised land and the judges are leading them, the tribe that brings idol worship back into the land and amongst the people of Israel is the tribe of Dan. And then we have this strange verse 18, which just seems to kind of stand out on its own. I look for your deliverance, Lord. And people theorize, why did Jacob say that there? Is he talking about what he had just said about the tribe of Dan? Is he maybe just because he is literally moments away from passing away? This is him saying, I look for your deliverance, I look for your salvation, Lord. Maybe he just knew the end is coming very, very soon, and rightly turned his eyes up to the Lord in that moment, in the midst of speaking to his sons. Gad, he will win in the end. The tribe of Gad settle on the other side of the Jordan here, which, when you are a nation like Israel that is constantly under attack, like it still is these days, when you're the nation of Israel, being on the other side of the Jordan, away from most of the other tribes, it did not go well for them a lot of times. They were the ones who were the first to be attacked a lot of the time. He will be attacked by a band of raiders, but he will attack them at their heels, it says. Verse 20, Asher's food will be rich. He will provide delicacies fit for a king. The tribe of Asher settles in a very fertile area. I'm going to keep on moving along here. Tribe of Naphtali. This one is a little tricky, even though it's very short. Naphtali is a doe set free that bears beautiful fawns. So there's a couple of ways. This is the other translation thing I was going to mention. The tribe of Naphtali, they settle in a hilly area where there were deer and things like that, so it could be a very literal type of thing. But also the word there that is translated as fawns, they use beautiful fawns, it in the Hebrew can also mean beautiful words. And so some translations have that instead. And if words is the proper translation, then that is fitting because in that area is where Jesus did many of his teachings. And so it would be prophetically speaking ahead about that. And then we end with Joseph. In his words about Joseph, Jacob lists a number of great titles for God. I want us to notice that. And remember back where Jacob started. When he first met with God, when God appeared to him, because God always comes to us first, by the way. We never reach out to God first. He is reaching out to us. And when God appeared to Jacob, Jacob described him as the God of his father and his grandfather, God of Abraham and Isaac. But it wasn't his God yet. And now let's see how far he's progressed here. In his words, he describes God as the mighty one of Jacob, the shepherd, the rock of Israel, who helps, and he is the Almighty. So there's, again, nothing but blessing here for Joseph. And then he describes Benjamin as a ravenous wolf. The tribe of Benjamin were a tribe of warriors. They were thought of as very fierce. Some people say they were the most fierce warriors of all the tribes of Israel. And some of the ones we see coming from there is Ehud, Saul, and in the New Testament, Paul, all come from that tribe. And all of them could be described as fierce in certain ways, sometimes not the most positive of ways, but they were all very fierce. Let's read to the end of the chapter here about Jacob's death. So starting in verse 29. Then he gave them these instructions. I am about to be gathered to my people. Bury me with my fathers in the cave in the field of Ephron the Hittite, the cave in the field of Machpelah near Mamre in Canaan, which Abraham bought along with the field as a burial place from Ephron the Hittite. There Abraham and his wife Sarah were buried. There Isaac and his wife Rebekah were buried, and there I buried Leah. The field and the cave in it were bought from the Hittites. When Jacob had finished giving instructions to his sons, he drew his feet up into the bed, breathed his last, and was gathered to his people. So, gathered to his people it's a euphemism for he died, he passed away. You know what, since we're running short on time, let me continue on. Let's go to verse 50. I was going to say a little something there first, but let me read the whole section and then we'll just wrap up. I'm going to read another 14 verses, chapter 50, verses 1 to 14, and this is the end of the story of Jacob. Joseph threw himself on his father and wept over him and kissed him. Then Joseph directed the physicians in his service to embalm his father Israel. So the physicians embalmed him, taking a full 40 days, for that was the time required for embalming. And the Egyptians mourned for him 70 days. When the days of mourning had passed, Joseph said to Pharaoh's court, "If I have found favor in your eyes, speak to Pharaoh for me. Tell him my father made me swear an oath and said, 'I am about to die. Bury me in the tomb I dug for myself in the land of Canaan. Now let me go up and bury my father, then I will return.' Pharaoh said, 'Go up and bury your father, as he has made you swear to do.' So Joseph went up to bury his father. All Pharaoh's officials accompanied him, the dignitaries of his court, and all the dignitaries of Egypt, besides all the members of Joseph's household and his brothers and those belonging to his father's household. Only their children and their flocks and herds were left in Goshen. Chariots and horsemen also went up with him. It was a very large company. When they reached the threshing floor of Atad near the Jordan, they lamented loudly and bitterly, and there Joseph observed a 7-day period of mourning for his father. When the Canaanites who lived there saw the mourning at the threshing floor of Atad, they said, 'The Egyptians are holding a solemn ceremony of mourning.' That is why that place near the Jordan is called Abel Mizraim. So Jacob's sons did as he had commanded them. They carried him to the land of Canaan and buried him in the cave in the field of Machpelah near Mamre, which Abraham had bought along with the field as a burial place from Ephron the Hittite. After burying his father, Joseph returned to Egypt together with his brothers and all the others who had gone with him to bury his father." So, quick little note at the end there. It was not a wise decision for them to go back to Egypt. They had gone back to the land that God had given them in Canaan to bury their father. Maybe Joseph had some sort of obligation to go back because of being the second in command to Pharaoh, but them going back is what eventually leads to the Israelites becoming an entire enslaved nation in Egypt until God frees them in the Exodus. So that's how all that story progresses, in case you didn't know. Look at the honor that is placed on this, the third patriarch of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Look at how much he is honored amongst the nation in which he had really done nothing. Right? It is because of his son that he is so honored, but he is honored by even all of Pharaoh's officials going with him for the burial. There's a couple of principles that I want to take from this passage this morning. Like I said, the first is we reap what we sow. The only time that we don't is when it's God's grace. We reap what we sow. Galatians 6:7-10 says, "Do not be deceived, God cannot be mocked. A man reaps what he sows. Whoever sows to please their flesh, from the flesh will reap destruction. Whoever sows to please the Spirit, from the Spirit will reap eternal life." So let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. You know, it's kind of funny. If any of us were planting a garden and we planted seeds for whatever we wanted to grow, cucumbers, whatever you want to say, we would not be surprised when later on we were reaping what we planted and it was cucumbers. Now, we would be very surprised if it was something else. But in life, so oftentimes, people will live a certain way. We will live in ways that are defying God. We are living in ways that break his commands. We are living in ways, even we who are followers of God, we live in ways so often that tend to ignore him. And then we act surprised when bad things end up coming from that, when we reap what we sowed. Are we living for the flesh, or are we living for the Spirit? Are we living for the finite pleasures this world has to offer, or are we living for the infinity of eternity that God promises us? We reap what we sow. If we sow in this life sin and rejecting Jesus Christ, in the next life we will reap the wrath of God, which is hell. But if we sow in this life faith in Jesus Christ and striving to live for the Lord, then the next life we will receive paradise. That is what God sent Jesus to do. That is why Jesus died on the cross, so that we can receive God's grace and mercy. The other principle I want us to remember from this passage is that God is in control. Jacob wasn't saying all these things on his own. Jacob was not some magician. He was not somebody who could just on his own see the future. This was God speaking words through Jacob. It's God who sees all things, knows what's to come, and that should give us great comfort, because it means our God is never caught off guard. Nothing in life ever surprises him, and so we don't need to worry. Faith in the one who knows all things helps take away worry. The more we trust in him, the less we will have stress and worry, and the more we can have joy in our lives. We're sitting here worrying sometimes, like, what's going to happen? Will I be okay? And our Father in heaven is looking down on us like we're a little child in his arms, and he's saying, just trust me. I'm carrying you where you need to go. Just trust me. Jacob came from a place where he did not stand on the Lord at all to a place where he continually stood on the Lord. It's amazing to see the way Jacob grew to become Israel, and the strength and character of the nation of Israel being built from its foundations. But the greatest foundation, of course, was faith in God. What do you want your legacy to be? I can think of none better than being known as the one who is faithful to the Lord. Let's pray, and then we will close with one more song. Heavenly Father, thank you for your teachings from your word. Thank you for your reminders that we need to be careful how we live. and we need to be focused on you. Lord, I pray that you would help us to do that. I pray that you would help us, like Jacob, as life continues on, that we would become more and more faithful to you and more trusting in you. I pray that you would bless this congregation, that you would bless everyone here in Jesus' holy name. Amen. If you would stand, let's sing one more song together.